she was a woman at work. To accomplish what she did, she wasn't a society lady. She looked like that from the outside, right? She went to parties, she went to dances, she loved the attentions of men, and right? But she, behind the scenes, she was doing something far more radical than that in what she was dreaming for Fenway Court.
Welcome back to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live on Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're continuing our look at women of style and substance by examining the life and legacy of Isabella Stewart Gardner, who died 100 years ago in 1924. Biographer Natalie Dykstra is author of the book Chasing Beauty, which is a remarkably detailed work, the result of several years of painstaking research, and she's here with us today to provide a greater understanding of Gardner's achievements. The subject invites a deeper examination of why we go to art museums, and the research is revealing more and more about that. Jeffrey K. Smith, a psychologist of aesthetics, first identified the museum effect about a decade ago, suggesting that museums, libraries, and cultural institutions educate us and civilize us as individuals and societies. Smith put forth the case that visitors who spend time with their thoughts elevated leave the institution as better people in some meaningful fashion. And your spirited responses to us suggest that it's all true. But first, let's begin by speaking to Natalie about this extraordinary life of Isabella Stewart Gardner, who was a complex and controversial woman for her time and made history in American art and culture. For a century, there's been a certain mystique about her. People called her Belle, and she deliberately assumed a kind of persona that in some ways was a wild contradiction for the time. A nouveau riche New Yorker, she married a Boston Brahmin, Jack Gardner, at the age of 20, but she was very atypical of the women around her. Belle had already lived and studied in Paris. She spoke fluent French, and she had developed an early appreciation for art. So, Natalie, you're going to tell us a little bit about the painstaking work that you did as a biographer to bring this piece to the publisher.
Yes, thank you, Mary, and thank you to Cambridge Forum and WGBH. I'm delighted to be here to talk about Isabella Stewart Gardner and Chasing Beauty. I was in preparing for my book tour. It was launched on March 26th. I was looking through early emails and notes and to try to remember sort of the origins. And my first email that I sent to the museum archivist, Shana, was dated March of 2014. So it's exactly 10 years ago that I first started that conversation of what's in the archives, what can we find, what is there more to discover. So yes, it's been a long project, but a very rewarding one. As I said to a group last night, she lived a long life, long and fascinating life, and she taught me much. She taught me much.
I think she's
and
taught
so
you.
I'm delighted to be here to talk about it. So I can for many in the Boston audience, they've been to the museum most likely at one point or another, but I'll give just a brief kind of overview of her life so we can kind of orient her in time. She was born in 1840 in New York, as you said, and she died in Boston on the fourth floor of Fenway Court, which is what the museum was called in her day, in 1924 at the age of 84. So that's a very long life when the typical age span was about mid-60s. And so she was born 20 years before the Civil War began, and she died in modernism. So she saw this, the emergence of America on the world stage. So much of her life interweaves with that American story as well. Um, so um, she early on married Jack Gardner, as you said, a Boston Brahmin, and they settled on 150 at 152 Beacon Street. Her father bought the lot and built the house for them as a wedding present. And early on, her life was marked by terrible tragedies. Her first pregnancy ended in a stillborn baby birth at 5 months, and then Jackie, her son was born. Their son was born in 1863, and he died in 1865, a month before the Civil War ended. And this twin losses, and then she was pregnant once more and lost that pregnancy at the end of 1865. And she was 26 years old, and her doctor at the time, Dr. Jacob Bigelow, told her, you cannot have children. It will kill you. She almost died with the last miscarriage. So now what? Right? That was really the story I wanted to understand more deeply. What would that have been like for her at that age, that young age, to be told you cannot have more children? What was she to do? And when so much of being a woman in that era was to have children, and of course Beacon Street was filled, those houses were filled with children running up and down the street. And so, yeah. Do you want to take it from there,
Yeah, sure.
Mary?
So you've painted quite a rich picture there. She came from New York. She came from newer money than Jack. So can you
Yes.
tell us two things? One is, how different were they from each other? And he obviously liked her, was enchanted by her. They met in Paris when she was there as a quite young girl.
Mm-hmm.
But
Teenager.
how did she fit in or not with these goodly ladies of Boston? Because she wasn't really into stitching and sitting around,
She
which is what they
actually
did.
did do stitching, but there's one piece at the museum in the chapel that you can see her crochet. But um, she was a very lively girl right from the start. You could see it in her um, the evidence that I had from her childhood. She was interested already in drawing and art and in music. She was an incredible athlete. She was considered the fastest runner at her school. She loved to spin cartwheels. She um, all of that is gold for a biographer because it gives you a sense of her physical self. She was a wonderful dancer. She sort of was said to glide across the dance floor like a ship in full sail. So she had very graceful movements. She was known for those graceful movements. So one of the discoveries of my research was her childhood friend, Helen Waterston, whose papers are at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and with whom she went to school in France, in Paris, at a Protestant convent school there. And she learned it was a French speaking only, so they had to speak French in classes, but also after classes. And that's where she first befriended Julia Gardner and Helen Waterston. And the three became this very tight circle. And Helen Waterston was a wonderful diarist who filled her diaries with a detail about their schooling and their teachers and the fun they had, and also Isabella's capacity for fun. She called it jollification. She had a capacity for jollification, which I loved, and was in the New York Times Book Review, caught that word, which I loved. And suddenly I had her childhood that I could understand her as a much younger person than had been understood before. I think I say in the book, it was some earlier accounts of Gardner it was as if she was Athena rising out of Zeus's head. She, coming out of nowhere basically. And in fact, she had this New York upbringing, and she was right. Her church was Grace Church at the bend of 10th and Broadway, which was the most fashionable church in New York. It's Edith Wharton's church as well, and is described beautifully in Age of Innocence. And this is really where music and the beautiful stained glass, sort of art and worship, that would have been her first experience of it in America. But certainly she went, there's records of her going to all these different cathedrals in Paris as a teenager. So by the time she got back to New York at 19, she could speak French and Italian, could read German, could read Latin. She was very, very sophisticated. And then after school had ended, she also traveled to Italy, Florence, Venice, Milan, and it's in Milan that she went to a house. It was a collection, a private collection at the time. It's now a small museum called the Poldi Pezzoli, kept the collection of Count Poldi Pezzoli. And she turned to a friend after seeing that collection at 15 and said, if ever I have the money, I want to build a beautiful house and fill it with beautiful things. So that was that comment was recorded in an early biography, in 1965 biography. But that, combined with finding these early records of her schooling, I just got utterly fascinated. What would it be like to have had a dream like that and then to fulfill it? Who gets that? How many years later? 50 years later.
True, but what came in between was to
But
have a
what
dream
came
like
in
that
between was
and come to Boston and
comes to Boston. And so she's from outside. I think that explains a lot of the social rejection that she experienced, because she was excluded from key social gatherings of women on Beacon Street. One of the sort of I don't want to say eccentricities of the Boston Brahmins, but what they called it were these sewing circles that women were assigned. They were really basically, this is going to be your sewing circle of 10 or 20 women, and that was your key social group all through your adult life. It's amazing now to think of that. And they did much more than sew. They read, they talked, they gossiped, they did much more than just sew, but they called it a sewing circle. And she wasn't included. She wasn't invited to one of those. And this then made it hard to figure out how to break into Boston, that elite Boston society. And one thing to think about, or one thing that I grappled with, is how to describe the difference between upper class, or the creme, or the elite society in Boston versus New York. You were able to come to New York and break in eventually, right? It was looser. The weave was looser. And in Boston, it was such a tight weave. And that's why we have those intermarried families. That's why they all married each other, and they all lived nearby each other. And so that was very hard to break into. Let me say something about the Gardner family, though. She was very fortunate in who she married, because she had the esteem of Jack, first of all, the love of Jack, but his brothers also were very fond of her, and her father-in-law, John Lowell Sr., adored her. And so I found letters that are in private hands of still in the family archive, where John Lowell Gardner Sr. is writing, "Dearest Belle," and talking to her about fashion and about religion and about what the grandkids are doing and about their travel plans and about horticulture. They shared a passion for horticulture. So this would have given her ballast, social ballast, to have the care. I did look in the vast Gardner family papers, which are at the Massachusetts Historical Society, for gossip about her. Did some of the brothers resent her? Did the in-laws? I was looking for any, and I just never found any mention about her in the family papers that was negative. So I mean, a
Well, that was
biographer can
fortunate.
only know so much, right?
Yeah.
Because you have to stay so tied to the evidence. But so that is a mixed picture then. She was rejected by the wider sort of Brahmin society, and these women, especially the men, were quite intrigued by her, and she
Cool.
was often asked to dance, and she got a lot of their attention. But
Well, we know she was independent and she was original and she was determined because Morris Carter,
yes,
her secretary, wrote that about her. But I have to say, she wasn't always likable, not just with the good ladies of Boston, but for example, Edith Wharton didn't like her. Now, she was younger than her. They had moved in similar circles. Henry James was ambivalent in some of the things he said. So she almost kind of took on this bohemian persona because it suited her. So it
you know,
gave
she
her.
she was such an individual. She was just it was as if they wanted her to conform more, be more recognizable, right?
Mhm.
And now I will say this about Henry James, and Colm Torbeen is brilliant about James. He is always ambivalent. He's ambivalent about Henry Adams. He's ambivalent about John Lafarge. He's his James's ambivalence is not really doesn't really register all that much about Gardner, because he is so often ambivalent about people. And that's part of what makes him such a great novelist, right? That people are always this and that, this and that, this and that, this
Mhm.
and that,
Mhm.
right? But he imported that into his interpersonal friendships, and so he always had, you know, I think he feared her intensity sometimes. He was
Mm.
jealous of her money, you know, and what she was able to buy. But he also very much admired her. He also very, very much admired her. One of my very favorite letters is his last one to her, where he said, he compared her to a jewel shining out from her setting in all its honor and interest and importance. And so you don't write that unless you have a certain connection to someone. And they knew each other. They didn't know each other. They grew up around the corner from each other in New York, but they didn't know each other in New York. Not that I knew. I couldn't find a connection between the Stewart family and the
Mm.
James
Mm.
family.
Mm.
Um,
So
so
let's move to another connection that's very important. So the art historian, Bernard Berenson, who, well, very important pivotal person in her life.
yes,
He's an advisor. He's the procurer of art for her in Europe, and she sticks with him despite some strange shenanigans financially, where Jack looks through some paperwork and is kind of shocked,
troubled.
troubled by the price of one particular painting, and there's some sort of an intrigue about what it really cost. And anyway, he kind of warns her off dealing with him. But anyway, she doesn't. She stays in connected with him for life. What was the basis of that? I mean, was it simply that they both needed each other?
Yes, and they were a generation apart. I think there was 25 years between them. So she first met him when he was a student at Harvard, a brilliant student. He had um, Berenson was Jewish and came from a Russian immigrant family, and he had an amazing memory. Like he had really an astonishing memory. Probably had photographic memory for what he saw and read. People noted it. She noted it. It is really, and it's how he was able to do what he did, because he could remember a painting he had seen 15 years before and the shape of a foot,
Mhm,
and
mhm,
then be
mhm.
able to identify a later painting. So he was incredibly interesting. So he had been a student of Charles Eliot Norton, who was the first professor of art history at Harvard, and had applied for a scholarship that's still in existence for Harvard students to study in Europe. And he at first wanted to be a novelist, literary arts, and he didn't get that scholarship, even though he was the most deserving of the students. And Gardner felt like this was unfair. And so she and Jack and several other families, pooled some funds and enabled him to study for a year in Europe. And he shifted from his interest in novels and writing to paintings and he spent many hours in all those beautiful European art museums, and then he falls away from her life, and it's not entirely clear why, but he comes back after he finishes the first volume of his masterpiece on Florentine drawings, and by then he is the most important connoisseur of Italian art in America. He comes back and he sends her a copy of the book, and from then on they are in correspondence. And by 1894, she's inherited her father's fortune, David Stewart's fortune, and she's also begun to be a serious collector. She bought the Vermeer's The Concert in 1892 in Paris, after her father's death in 1891. And so now he has the knowledge and skill, and she has the income. She has the resources, and they have so much to talk about. And so one of my favorite letters is an early one where he writes to her, so how badly do you want a Botticelli? Tell me how much you want a Botticelli, or something is the phrase. And so it commences, and that is the correspondence. That's the largest correspondence that's published, thankfully, because even though Gardner asks her friends and family to burn her letters, Berenson disobeys her. And so, thankfully, because he knew her fame, their fame depended on each other. So we have a very clear record of that correspondence. Most likely there are some letters that are missing that we don't know about. But
we ought to mention that, Natalie. We haven't actually said that. The remarkable thing here is she wanted everybody to just destroy all the correspondence that she had with them.
And I was asked that question last night. I get asked that question, why did people, but this was common. They had an utterly different understanding of privacy than ours. I mean, to post pictures on an internet for strangers to see would have seemed utterly foreign. And so the feeling was, it's really nobody's business, including my family's business.
We're back with this contradiction thing again, which I love. Yes. Every time I think I've got a handle on this woman, she contradicts herself.
Yes.
So she courted and loved publicity,
of course,
had publicity.
Of course.
And yet destroy my letters. It's very strange, almost, she had
She's
this prophesied.
Yeah, because she wants to save what she wants to save, right? Because she's telling her story.
You're right. She's in control.
She's curating her letters, the letters that come in. And so, but to be fair to Gardner, or to put her in context, not fair, but to put her in context, Henry Adams, and we have 7 volumes of his letters, he destroyed all his diaries. And he writes in his letters how he's destroying his diaries. Right? And you think, oh, please don't. Henry James, for all the letters we have, we know that there's so many more that were destroyed. So that was once someone knew that there were going to be people like me, biographers and others coming behind them, they wanted to shape how we knew them. So
let's do this. This is kind of interesting to me. I noticed it this time going around the museum. Is Bella liked to behave like royalty. She definitely had this kind of pretension to be aristocratic, and she actually pretended that there was a link between her and Mary Queen of Scots, which there isn't.
Right.
And it's not even spelt the same. The Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots is S-T-U-A-R-T, but anyway, she loved style, she liked grandeur, she liked summoning people to these gatherings. And some people got testy about that. They felt it was almost like a royal summons.
It was anti-democratic, right? It was, we're in America.
Yeah.
Right.
And then she started collecting pearls, which were the trademark of royalty at that time. And that very first string of pearls she got in Paris was $10,000, right?
Mm-hmm.
$10,000. So was this obsession with kind of status, did it stem from insecurity, or what do you think?
That's a very good question. I don't think I've been asked that question in quite that way. Let me talk about there is a vulnerable side to her, for sure. I mean, she had enormous confidence as a teenager, and you can see that in the testimony of her friends, and how much fun she had. She had just a capacity for fun, as I said before, and life, and just this voracious curiosity. But she was very badly smashed. I mean, her life in her 20s was smashed. And that gave her, what I started to understand, let's put it this way. What I started to understand is that there was a front stage of her personality, a kind of noisy, performative, glamorous part. And then there was a backstage to her personality and story, which was more tender, more shy, more worried, but also, as I say at the end of one of the chapters, she was a woman at work. To accomplish what she did, she wasn't a society lady. She looked like that from the outside, right? She went to parties, she went to dances, she loved the attentions of men, and right? But behind the scenes, she was doing something far more radical than that in what she was dreaming for Fenway Court, right? And so that I wanted that aspect of her to be I wanted her to be a three-dimensional figure, right? Because I think historically in the 20th century, she got inadvertently sort of overshadowed by her accomplishment. It was hard to see her in the glare of the brilliance of that museum. And so the woman who created it got a little bit overshadowed, and how to bring her into the light, so to speak.
Until they unveiled the name of the museum.
Right, exactly. Fenway Court, right. She because she knew, do you want to know why the name changed? So it was Fenway Court in her time, and then legally in the will, it's to be changed to Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, because she knew the men around her, like Berenson, like Charles Eliot Norton, like Henry James, John Singer Sargent. They would be credited with the museum, and
she was right.
Going to insist that she was the author of this place.
Very smart. Okay,
she was very smart.
It's time to look at some pictures, because some people may not know about some of these portraits. So it also introduces, so we've got three here. So but two very different styles on the outside. These are portraits of her, two different points in her life. So perhaps you could tell us, this one here on our right is the sergeant. The younger woman holding her hands in an arc here. And this is done when she's 48, I believe.
1888, John Singer Sargent. That's right.
And this one is the Zorn, and this is
Anders Zorn. He's a Swedish painter in 1894, and that's the cover of the book. Yeah.
And she's 54 in this. So look how much she evolves from here to here. Even though this is considered very, very risque at the time because of this revealing neckline. And so it brings up a very contentious little topic. She definitely liked men. Now, I'm not implying anything, but she was often in the company of men, and she got on well with them. And one of the men that she was particularly attracted to was Frank Crawford, who was younger than her, 12 years younger than her, I think.
16 years younger than her, which is an important detail in the story. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you take it from there. Why was this called Crawford's Notch, and why did Jack not want it shown in public?
Well, let me back up to William Crawford is who he's known as. He was he was a novelist, and when she met him in 1882 to 3, he was just starting on his literary career. He had been raised in Rome. He was fluent in Italian. His father was Thomas Crawford, who was the American sculptor whose statue is atop the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And so his family was part of that, all that expat Americans in Rome at the time, in the early part of the 19th century. He was very fluent in, he had many languages, Italian, Urdu, he spoke Urdu, Greek. So he comes to Boston to see his family because he's the nephew of Julia Ward Howe, and his cousin, he was very close to his cousin Maud Howe, Julia's daughter, and they live on Beacon Street. And so he's visiting, and of course, Jack and Isabella are on Beacon Street, and most likely it's through Julia and Maud that Frank and Isabella meet. So we know that Frank would come and talk to Jack about finance and Boston politics, and then he and Isabella would read Dante in Italian. And this was thrilling and interesting. And I call the chapter the Cosmopolitan because he was sophisticated and in many ways, but he was a bit of a empty shirt. Another way, his parents were deeply worried about him because he would kind of bounce from one future to another. He could never quite settle down, and they were very worried about this. Yeah, they were very worried about this. And so this then becomes this kind of, I called it a romantic friendship. It's definitely their friends, and they have a lot of interest in common. He was also, according to Maud Howe, devastatingly handsome and athletic, and she Isabella appreciated that in a man. And Gardner, the Gardners had been married about 23 years by that point, and she's in her early 40s. A younger man is paying her a lot of attention. You can see all the ingredients, and yet it seemed, so they have this time on the North Shore at a house that the Gardner family owned near the water, that it seemed that they were there with servants, but basically by themselves. And Jack was in town because he was at his family's financial firm, and gossip flew. And Henry James, we know that because Henry James is such a great recorder of social gossip. And he thought it was the most delicious sort of Boston gossip of the summer, that there was this affair. He didn't call it an affair, but this relationship. And there was lots of speculation. And then the connection to the sergeant. So let me finish this, close up the circle of the Frank. So there's lots of worried letters back and forth between Julia Ward Howe and Frank's father. What are we going to do? This isn't good. This has to stop. And within a week's time of these letters that I could track, Frank is going back to Italy, and within 6 months, he's married to someone else. And Jack takes Isabella on a tour of Asia, and it's their longest trip. And there's a wonderful opening line of his diary, travel diary, of that trip to Asia in 1883, that starts in 1883, where he says, "Hurrah, I'm on the boat," right? There's just this feeling of like he's out from under that social pressure. So, a biographer only can go as far as the evidence. Correct. And so one of the things that I'll come to the sergeant portrait in a minute, but I personally don't feel that they physically consummated that relationship, because I get asked this a lot, because Frank Crawford comes back later, 10 years later, he comes back. And it seems impossible that she would allow that it just seems impossible that if they had had a full-blown affair. But it did cause some pain in their marriage, for sure, because when John Singer Sargent comes to America because he's living overseas, comes to America to paint portraits in Boston. He paints Isabella's in 1888, and it's shown at the St. Botolph's Club at a Sargent show. That's the list of paintings in that show. It just knocks you over because there's some of his masterpieces, including the Gardner portrait. And the gossip in the men's clubs, of which Jack was a member of many, was that the décolleté of the Sargent portrait reminds people of a mountain range in New Hampshire called Crawford's Notch. And so it is the case that Jack asks her never to show that painting in public in his lifetime again. So it's in his study. He pays Sargent $3,000 for it, and he has it in his study. And then after Jack's death, it's in the Gothic room. But the Gothic room was also a private space in her lifetime. It's now public, obviously, and that's where it is now. So she honored his wishes. And
Okay.
and I was talking to someone who very familiar with this story. I let the reader make some,
yeah. Yes. Okay. I just wanted to mention, we don't have to discuss it, but I think it's a good point that someone's written into the chat here. A woman called Betty Ann regrets that her mother-in-law destroyed the letters from her husband from London during the Second World War when he was in the Office of War. She notes that these days, with less and less letters written, biographers would have a much harder time as people write emails now, which is a very good point. Makes it very difficult going forward for how we're going to research people. Especially
I was at a biography conference in New York last week, and the biographer of Joni Mitchell was talking about how impossibly hard it is mid-century because people talked on the phone. They didn't write emails. They didn't write it down. They were most of her communication was on the phone, Joni Mitchell. So how do you recover that?
Very, very
yeah. So it is. And texts, I mean, there's whole conferences for archivists and librarians about what kind of technology you need to have in order to be able to read floppy disks from the 1980s, right? People are starting to donate their archives, and they have floppy disks, but we don't have a way to read them. So
okay, travel. So
travel.
You alluded to the first trip, which was very important. After the miscarriages, the death of the baby.
That's to Europe. That's to Northern Europe and Scandinavian Russia, right?
So the point I want to raise, because we want to pull up some more pictures here, is that she escapes the confines of Boston, and in Venice, she discovers the joys of artists and writers at the Palazzo Barbaro. And this is like heaven to her. It sparks the idea that one day she'll create this space styled on the 15th century palace, which combines architecture as a palace of memory. And so these were taken last week at the Isabella Stewart Gardner.
Oh, yeah, look at those Mayflowers.
Yeah, that gives them some idea of the scale and the design with this very unusual architecture.
So notice a couple things. Let's have people notice a few things. So the balustrades that you can see set in the wall, those were from scrap yards in Venice, where she would go to these dealers, antiquity dealers, because the palazzos were being sort of dismembered by princes, right? And because they could no longer afford them, or for whatever reason. And so she purchased these and then ships them back. And that is what's so extraordinary. What she does is, and she has a glass roof. You can see that in the middle picture, that beautiful middle picture, which at first the engineers and architects were, how are we going to do this? Right? Because snow and wind and the weather, and it's not Venetian weather, right? And so she really turns the palazzo inside out. So that surface looks like the exteriors of the palaces along the Grand Canal, and with the balustrades and so those are wonderful pictures. And it's really concrete, it's paint. The paint is a combination of a white and pink paint that she has mixed. And there is a record of her showing the painters how to do it, because at first they were applying it in not the right way. And it is astonishing effect. It has really an astonishing effect. And
Pink.
what a surprise it was for on a snowy Boston day to come off the Fenway and suddenly it feels like you're not in America anymore. Right. And in that middle photograph that you have on the screen, that's a beautiful Roman floor from the 3rd century, built first in a palazzo during Hadrian's rule. And in the center coin, like that center image, is of a Medusa. So that was a gift from Jack in 1898. I think he purchased that as a gift to her. So, but this is her vision of this interior courtyard. And I think many people have said, art curators and art historians say that's really her masterpiece, is that space. The way she brings in color and light and living plants. And she used to have, for the opening, she had bird cages that were hidden, so you couldn't see it, but you could hear the bird song. And can you imagine?
So let's
transporting. It was transporting, and she wanted that effect, right? That was the effect, to take you out, to immerse you, and to take you out.
And it takes you up because of the
and
height.
up, and up. Yes,
transcend. It's true.
Yes.
So we've got this picture of her. She starts to travel. She starts to meet all these interesting artists and writers when she's in Venice. And then she kind of collects this really interesting coterie of friends. And they're not typical in any manner. As some of them are musicians, and they give recitals when they come back to Boston. And she helps support some of those artists, including Satie. And then she also allows people that at the time were not allowed to be homosexual as part of her friends too, including Oscar Wilde. And it's as if she's kind of flaunting the rules, but she also operates kind of on the edge of what's acceptable. So she's drawn, I think, to people who also might be slightly ostracized by mainstream society.
She was singular. She was such an individual. That would have been the language they used, that and so she was drawn to very strong personalities, and she was very drawn to this group, and they were so wonderful to her. It was called the Dabbsville Group, and there's a wonderful book coming out this June, more about the Dabbsville Group, by a wonderful art historian. And the key figure in that group is A. Pied Andrew, who later was congressman in Massachusetts for that district. But A. Pied Andrew was openly gay and had many partners, and did not hide this. And she seemed very at ease in this social milieu. Part of it is, they had so much to talk about. So he loved art as well. And Henry Sleeper was also in that group. And he, of course, did the beautiful Beauport house that people know on Eastern Point. And he was an important interior decorator. So they had so much to talk about. But they also weren't talking about children and grandchildren. And I think many of the social occasions that she had to attend was about those, those kids and grandkids. And in Dabbsville, with the Dabbsville Group on the North Shore, that is not what they were talking about. And so I think, there's a series of snapshots and snapshot albums that A. Pied Andrew kept, and it's very moving because there's pictures of her in her 70s, and they're 20, 30 years younger than she is. And they have their arms around her. She felt very, very cared for in that group and known. She felt seen by them. She felt seen by them and understood. Akakura too was such an important friendship that started in 1904. He was a curator of Japanese art at the MFA, so he would walk over to Fenway Court, and they had so much to talk about because they were both sort of cosmopolitans that were not quite at home where they were, right? They were both world travelers, Akakura and she. And so that was a very important relationship.
Mm.
And they understood he would write to her about loneliness, what it was to be lonely. So then I knew that she talked to him about feeling lonely.
Opened up. Mm.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, just another little point somebody's put here, which I think is rather interesting. My grandmother was a nurse to her at one point. I was wondering if she came across any documentation that she needed a nurse, and she gifted her green silk stockings since she was Irish. My,
Yes.
my grandmother died in 1920 from the Spanish flu. Interesting.
Oh, I would be grateful to hear from this.
You'd have to put her details in the chat.
Yes, yes. That is
Whoever,
you can see my
anonymous person.
face. Yes, of course. I think I know who this is. And because she
No,
did
okay.
have a nurse that died, she had a very important person in her life, in her household, who died in 1920.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
yeah, I
Yes.
wonder if that's who that is. Oh, I would love to know. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, very important point now, money. We can't overlook money. So as you alluded, when her father died, he left her, she was the only surviving child, 2.75 million, which now is worth $78 million. And Jack, of course, was a very successful man in his own right. So their combined fortune was 142 million at that point in today's currency. So there was a lot of discretionary income for her to spend. So I don't want to get into, we can't really get into the possible links with the slave trade because first, we don't have a lot of time, but clearly some of it probably indirectly came from the fruits of that labor, as all money in that kind of era did. And Jack also managed to pay his way out of having to go to war, to the Civil War. He was able to pay, there was a certain exemption you could pay if you were rich enough. So I know you said we haven't got
Separate
enough
those
evidence.
questions a minute, Mary. Let
Yeah,
me separate those out.
yeah.
So for everyone interested in sort of the sources of the family wealth, I really point to a recent publication by the museum called Isabella Stewart Gardner, A Life.
Mhm.
It's a companion volume to their 2017 guide to the collection. It's beautifully written and it's very detailed about yes, show it. Yes, that's perfect. It's very detailed about both the Stewart money that she inherits from her father, but then also the Gardner family. So it has it both in the text and in the endnotes. The connections weren't as direct as some other Boston families, right?
Mm.
They weren't trading in cotton. Um, they were in a different part of the merchant trade. But that I point people to that source, and I also have it in my endnotes as well. Um, and the second part is about Jack's non-participation in Civil War. So he, like Henry Adams, there were other Bostonians who did not serve. And there was a combination of factors that I tried to sort of not clarify, but describe in that chapter. It is the case that he was in finance and he was a very trusted sort of person in finance, and the economy needed to keep going during the war.
Mhm.
He had just had a baby. His wife just had a baby. Um, and so we don't know the conversations. There's just no record of any letters between the brothers, between, oh boy, I wish there had been, right? I wish there had been more documentation in some way.
But they
So
had
we could
visits from
know the
people.
reasoning for it. We could know the reasoning for it.
Mm.
And then what I ended up doing is doing a lot of research about the churches that they went to. The Emmanuel Church was first, and that was an abolitionist church. Actually, the daughters of of Harriet Beecher Stowe went to Emmanuel Church in Boston, and the preacher was an abolitionist, and that was Jack and Isabella's first church. And I found that very interesting because we so sort now politics. Our politics so sort our church membership. And in that era, as I was reading Boston scholarship about this, or scholarship about Boston in that time period, churches were very mixed politically. And I thought that was and I got very interested in this friendship that Jack had with Henry Higginson, the founder of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, who did serve in the war and was badly wounded, had a bad scar on his left cheek, and also had very bad injuries in his saber wounds. But Henry Higginson adored Jack Gardner, thought him his best friend. And I thought, so did he resent Jack for not serving, especially because Higginson had sacrificed, his own health and risked his own life. And so that was, that's kind of the paths that I went to try to understand that time of their life. And then I guess I let readers decide what they think about that.
Okay, so she was exceptionally lucky in that she had a great deal of money. She was also very lucky that she had the opportunity to study at a time when women weren't able to study, and study with first-class professors. Charles Eliot Norton at Harvard that you mentioned. So now she's got this great exposure to art and literature and ideas and philosophy. So hence, even though part of her travels are in some ways facilitated by the fact that she's living in a kind of colonial universe, she doesn't seem closed-minded. Her notebook seems to suggest she's interested in other people and different cultures, not dismissive, so open and curious, which I think is probably pretty atypical for her fellow passengers probably at this time.
I mean, what really is remarkable about her is her ravenous curiosity for the world. She's just interested in so much. It's not only art, it's music, it's fashion, it's horticulture, it's and there's these wonderful lines in Jack's diary where he says, "Belle is off to church, I am resting." She just couldn't get enough. There's a wonderful line about their trip to Spain, and he says, Auntie Belle is to a nephew. Auntie Belle is complaining we didn't do enough, we didn't see enough, and then he lists all the cities that they had gone to in the space of 2 weeks by train, and so she just, as Holland Cotter, the wonderful art critic for the Times, says, more is more. She just had this. And it saved her life. It saved her life. That her eye, her capacity to respond. There's these wonderful passages in her travel albums, in the early travel albums, where there's diary entries where she says, "I want to remember this always." She just has this openness to, and that's why people love, to experience. And she was fearless, right? She was very athletic. She liked horseback. She could go on donkey, didn't have to be comfortable. She never got sick. She rarely got sick. So she just was, and all of those were huge advantages. There were a lot of wealthy people in Boston in the Gilded Age.
Didn't do that.
And they didn't do this.
Yeah.
Right. And they didn't do this. So
okay, spirituality. This is a very important topic. So we know she was raised Episcopal, and you mentioned Grace Church, but she was not fervently religious. And she became more spiritual, according to your book, as her life progressed and got more
Degree.
involved in social
Yeah.
causes and
Yep.
donated to a variety of different charities. She
Yep.
also sought an audience with the Pope when she was in Rome. And
Yes, of
in the
course.
museum, there are a lot of religious images, particularly
Yeah.
of Madonna and Child, lots. Also has a functioning chapel. So, do you think Isabella regarded art as a spiritual experience?
Yes, I think that started at Grace Church. I think it was this joining that art opened you up to something transcendent. Beauty of all kinds, musical beauty. That beauty was had asked not only, but had the aesthetic experience had an aspect of spirituality. And so she was, she was fascinated by different ways of worship.
Mm.
And she was fascinated by, she loved Buddhist temples. She
Mm.
thought they were so extraordinarily beautiful in Japan. The design of them, the sound of the
The gong,
gongs
yeah.
in them, right? The incense, the monks' garb.
Chanting. And she talks about the
She
chanting.
noticed all of that, the colors that they wore. Um, so she, yes, I think beauty, her capacity to see it, know it, get
Feel it.
close to it,
Mm.
it was saving to her.
Yeah, because she didn't go about converting people.
No,
No,
she
no.
had no interest in that. She wasn't doctrinaire. She didn't sign up to a particular doctrine, and
Mm.
she wasn't an evangelical. She didn't think she had to convert anybody. And that was for her generation in America, right? There that she, although Episcopalians typically don't, but so of that era. So you're exactly right. Spirituality was something that expanded her world, not contracted it.
Okay, someone's written in the note here, it's quite important. Two people mentioned it was very common for wealthy men to pay someone to take their place during the Civil War. The substitute got a bounty payment. In the
Yes.
southern states, occasionally black slaves were paid to take their master's place as well. It's interesting.
Yeah, that's very
Okay.
interesting comment.
We are going to run over, I'm telling you now, because there's just so much more we have to talk about. So Belle was freed up in many ways by becoming a widow in 1898, because not that she didn't miss Jack, she did miss him terribly, but she now devoted all of her energy to her
Mhm.
work and was able to open the museum in 1903, which was her lifetime's ambition. And now she's almost 63 years of age.
Mhm.
And she sold Beacon Street and she sold Green Hill to
Nope,
help.
not she
No.
holds on to Green Hill. She does sell Beacon Street, but she holds on to Green Hill till much later in her life, and
Oh, okay.
she gifts it to a descendant. So I just want to be clear about Green Hill.
Okay. So she needs the money to keep buying artwork. And she said her lifetime goal was to create a museum for art education, especially by the public exhibition of works of art. Very strong, the public exhibition. And she had achieved the first purpose-built US museum established by a woman. And she had spent, in today's money, 76 million on art. Do you think she grasped the enormity of what she had accomplished?
Yeah, yeah. I
You
mean,
did.
yes, I do. I mean, there's these because she lives long enough, right? She dies and she lives another 20
20
years.
years. Mm.
And that's what's so moving about her story. I got so interested in the shape of her life, that early catastrophe, then this long quiet, and then you can see how she's like growing and expanding and learning all the time. And then this flowering at 63. Most people were, people lived on average to about 63, 65 at that in that time. And so to have the December bloom, as I say, you know, um, in the
It's an
book,
inspiration, really.
that
Mm.
is, it's rare to have a 19th century story where a woman of that age has this extraordinary accomplishment and then lives long enough to know it,
Mm. Good
right?
point.
And but she's also terrified. I mean, I don't want to say terrified, but she's sometimes frightened, frustrated. You know, the sort of grand opening in 1903 was this wonderful celebration, and you know, she was so pleased with how everything looked. And the next year, there's a letter, a little bit, 18 months later, she writes to Berenson, "You ask if I am happy, and I say I want to be when I don't feel lonely."
Oh, interesting.
And so it makes such sense, though. You know, she is singular.
Mm.
You know, but what is the shadow side of that, right? And
The
I
rugged
think,
individualist,
yes,
doomed
yes,
to be alone.
yes, yes. And she had this sort of, now, how do you run a museum? How do you do this? You know, it's not like she could call up a friend and say, "How do you do it?" Right? She had to figure it out. And always she was surrounded by men, right? So all the trustees of the first trustees of the museum were men. And there's this wonderful letter where an art historian from Harvard is writing her, asking for money, because people always asked her for money. And she writes back and she says, who do you think I am? I'm a one-woman museum over here. You know, I'm trying to do something here. And it's hard. It was hard. It was really, she had to work incredibly. She had to keep her focus. So I have that in the prologue, how she had to be very clear what her goals were. And then pursue them, because it could have gone.
Yes, it could.
We're on this side of her accomplishment and success. She was on the other side, and it really could have gone bad.
And, you know, the latter part of her life, she's competing with all the, you know, the Morgans and the other infinitely wealthier people. They're snapping up pieces of art.
Infinitely more wealthy. As astounding as those numbers are that you gave, they were in the hundreds of millions of dollars. They were in the, you know, the Bill Gates of the era. And she was not. And she was really not.
Okay,
there's a wonderful scene.
accolades.
Just say one anecdote about JP Morgan. He would buy up whole palazzos. He would just buy the whole palazzo, and then he would decide what he wanted to keep and take out, and then sell the rest. And she wasn't able to do that.
No. Somebody's just written, it's absolutely remarkable what she accomplished, especially during a time period where women were still so often second-class citizens. But she persevered and created the most remarkable palace of art in our country, despite all the obstacles. I love Isabella Stewart Gardner.
That's a beautiful comment. That's a moving comment. Isn't that moving? How she still has such, it's very moving the way that's written. Thank you for that comment.
Somebody else has asked, is there anyone in modern times you would compare her to?
I've thought about that. I have thought about that. Someone who really knows how to take a stage like that. You know, kind of her entrepreneurial skills. I sort of think of Martha Stewart in some way.
Or Oprah
right.
Winfrey,
Her ability, you know, her capacity to learn, her curiosity. You know, a question that I often get is, would I be friends with her? Could I be? And I always say, oh,
that was
absolutely.
My next question. You would?
Yeah. I mean, I have enormous affection and admiration for her. I didn't always feel that way about her when you know, she was hard to understand at first, and I didn't quite, and she scared me, and it just felt like such an enormous task. But you know, she is fundamentally a 19th century person. I am fundamentally in the 21st century. And so to imagine that collapse of time, it just makes no sense in my brain. Somehow I can't, and I think as a biographer, you don't want to get too cozy with your subject.
No.
And friend is too cozy. But do I admire her? Yes, absolutely.
And, you know, the other question is, she might not have been friends with us. She was very...
Totally. Absolutely.
So She was a pioneer. She had great resilience, and she definitely shared the transformative power of art with us, and that endures. So I just want to shift in the last few minutes here. We're going to go on for another 5 minutes about this broader question of what we all gain from art museums. And we had asked people when they signed up whether art museums improve your quality of life, and everybody that responded said unanimously yes. And some of the things that they said were remarkable. So I'm just going to say some of them because I thought they were wonderful. And they really enforce what we've been talking about here today, the transformative aspects of going into an art museum. They always surprise me and swivel my viewpoint 180 degrees. I like to see beauty, to see a different reality.
Mm-hmm.
Art is inspiring and it brings me joy, especially when I'm down. So it has an antidepressant effect. It
Mm-hmm.
expands my world, my understanding of other times, other cultures, and the beauty of the artwork inspires me.
Mm-hmm.
As a disabled woman, I wish I could go more often than once or twice a year because they do improve the quality of my life greatly.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a few people put, I don't go regularly because it's too expensive, which is kind of interesting. That's another program right there. I love my thoughts and perspectives shaken up, calmed, and motivated in new directions.
Yes.
Yes, I have loved going all my life. As an artist, they take me to another artist's perspective on the world.
Yes.
So all of these people talk about their improving their mentality, their consciousness, their understanding, their knowledge, their appreciation for others and different kinds of people and thinking, which I think is remarkable. And there was I put a link in the chat box to the Maya Gallery in Santa Fe wrote an article about the 5 benefits of visiting art galleries, one of which is improving your memory. It
Mm-hmm.
enhances cognitive function. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a good reason to go. And
Mm-hmm.
then a University of Arkansas study showed that children who visit an art gallery increase their critical thinking skills and they improve their empathy. We all need more of that. And as you raised when we were talking about this earlier, Natalie, they are also an economic benefit to the
Yes.
community where they exist. So lots and lots of good reasons to go to.
There's a wonderful writer named Edmund de Waal, and he writes a book called Letters to Commando about a house museum in Paris that was opened in the early 20th century. And he has a wonderful phrase that to be in that museum is to still the world. There is it's almost like time
That's interesting.
feels different.
Suspended.
It's suspended and that
Mm.
you're held. One of the phrases I have is the gallery's embrace, that there's something about this being in those spaces that you feel held in a different time. And then that somehow when you walk back out of the museum, you walk into the world in just a slightly different way. And it's hard to even sometimes pinpoint what that is. It's hard to put it into words sometimes. Sometimes you can find words for it, but oftentimes you can't. And yet it seems like an incredibly important part of cultural life and city life and just human life is to witness visual representation of the world that we inhabit.
And
So
get off our phones for
and
5
get off our phones.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the things I really wanted is to have the reader imagine Gardner standing at the Prado looking at art. And what is that to look at art? What is it? What happens between our eyes and that canvas, that flat two-dimensional canvas, right? In her day, right? I mean, I know there's different kinds of art, but what is it and that was a question she was asking, and Henry James was asking, and John Singer Sargent was asking. They were all asking that question. What is it is it an exchange that happens?
Mm.
Is it and it's the question we continue to ask.
Couple of more little things before we have to close out here. When you were talking about the woman of today that might replicate her, somebody
Yes.
called Wilhelmina Halliday, who founded the National Museum of Women in the Arts in DC.
Yes, that's a really wonderful museum. That is a name that is akin. Yes, I think that's right. That's a very good suggestion.
And then
Um,
somebody's reminding everyone, and this is a really good point for the financial aspect. If you go to your local libraries and sign up, you can all get free passes to Isabella Stewart Gardner and most museums in Boston. You just have to sign up and book it for a certain day, and it doesn't cost
yes,
anything, just a library card. So
and
that's a good
just a
point.
suggestion for people going, if you can go on a Thursday evening, not the third Thursday of the month, but a Thursday evening, they're open from 5 until 9. And
That's when
that
I
is a
went. It was brilliant.
that's when Mary went and
Yeah, it
had
was
those
super.
beautiful
It was
photographs.
lovely. Yeah.
Yep.
Um, Also, just so you know, if you walk around an art gallery for 35 minutes, just 35 minutes, your cortisol level drops. So
To still the world.
think about that.
Yeah.
Still world.
Yes.
Okay, so Natalie, what can I say? Thank you. I could talk for another half an hour to you about this. It's just so brilliant.
Thank you so much, Mary.
You've shared so much knowledge and insight and inspiration today. So thank
Thank
you
you so
so much.
much. I'm honored to have been able to talk with you and with the audience and all these wonderful questions, and of course to talk about Isabella. So thank you.
So put Chasing Beauty on your list, everybody. It's really worth
Thank
your time. It's full of good stuff. The people jump off the page. So Cambridge Forum, made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Massachusetts Cultural Society, and the Lowell Institute, and you. So if you haven't given us anything in a while or ever, please go to the website www.cambridgeforum.org and you can donate via that. And you can also sign up for the e-newsletter. Doesn't cost anything. And thanks again, Natalie.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you.